Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing okay first thing on this Monday morning. Welcome to our second virtual affordable housing forum. Today's topic is going to be land leases and the development process from the developer's perspective. My name's John Connell. I'm Implementation Manager at the County of Simcoe Social Housing Department, and I'll be the moderator for this session. I don't know about where you live, but we've certainly had a lot of active weather over the last 12 hours, the wind and the snow and the sleet. So it's a good day to be indoors. I'm glad you could join us, and we're very pleased to have Robert Voigt with us this morning as our presenter. Robert is Director of Planning with Parkbridge Communities, and he'll be sharing with us. This session is being recorded and will be available for you to play back afterwards via the county's website. You also have an opportunity to ask questions as Robert's going through his presentation, but we won't actually deal with the questions until he has finished speaking. And the way you can ask questions is if you hover your mouse so that the bar appears on the screen there. There'll be one with a question mark inside a bubble box. It says show Q&A. So if you click on that, you can then type in your question and then we will either publish the questions so that everybody can see them and we'll discuss them publicly, or we can answer them privately as well. So we'll get going. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Robert to share with us. Welcome, Robert.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to do a quick share screen here to make sure that you can see the presentation that I'm going to be referring to. Alrighty. Yeah, I'd like to welcome everyone for again taking the time to be part of this session today. You're going to see a bunch of information here that, as was described, is relates to a variety of perspectives relating to how we create attainable housing within our communities, and much of this is from a framework of material that was presented through a series of workshops that we ran last year, and I'll highlight a little bit about that. There you can see a bit of my sort of technical experience there. As was noted, I'm the Director of Planning for Parkbridge Lifestyle Communities, and also when I'm not doing that as my day job, I'm spent a lot of time as the providing services to the membership of the Georgian Triangle Development Institute as their president, which is a role I took over at the beginning of this year. In terms of my experience with housing, I have lived in almost every kind of housing that you might expect within our culture here in Canada. A lot of that, you can imagine, is diversity comes through, just kind of standard experience of someone, going through their life course, going to university, and starting a career, starting a family, and the kinds of different changing needs that you have from a housing perspective. And I think that's something that we need to have better understanding in terms of the processes that we create when it comes to developing housing for our communities. In terms of other experience, I've also built homes, and when it comes to the professional end of things, I've worked in all forms of residential zoning and all that process and policy work, as well as a number of kind of specialized housing types of projects, looking at mixed-use residential, being part of an affordable housing task force when I worked down in the States, and in Washington State, also looking at municipal and provincial housing policies, and also helped found a community land trust, which is actually very similar to the work I now do in Parkbridge, because it relates to the underlying approach is through land lease, which is an inherently more attainable form of housing, which I'll get into shortly. So as I noted, there was the beginning of last year, we came together with Parkbridge spearheading this. We partnered with the Rural Ontario Institute and the Ontario Professional Planners Institute, got some support from CMHC to create a series of workshops called Homeward. And that was really focused on developing missing middle housing. And the idea was that we would bring together people from various aspects of the housing industry, not only elected officials and folks working for municipalities, but also developers and anyone that felt they were a stakeholder in this, so that they could have a greater understanding of what was involved in providing housing for their communities, but particularly focused on small urban centers and rural communities. And the goals specifically were to create a deeper understanding of the range of housing options and the challenges facing communities and their ability to provide attainable housing, to broaden our understanding of the various influences on housing attainability amongst community members, municipal staff, elected officials, and developers, and then to showcase regional and local programs, projects, and champions that were providing opportunities for local attainable housing, and showcase opportunities to provide attainable housing through various development models, including land lease. And then finally, create a community of interest amongst the participants in all the forums that we held. And then we're going to showcase the information. There were a number of people that were involved in helping create those workshops. We held 3 of them, and here's some of the folks that if you are looking to reach out to people that are particular experts in this field, I would recommend each and every one of them. They brought very meaningful information to the workshops, and I would reach out to them at any time if I was looking for that kind of expert level of understanding of housing that you may not find just within your whatever your local or sort of personal organization might have. Unfortunately, then this thing happened. This is why we're having this conversation this way today. It also impacted those workshops. So we still have not been able to finish the production of the materials in terms of providing that output. So it has created a bit of a hiccup, but as you can imagine, it also, particularly for those small urban centers and rural communities, in many ways it has exacerbated the housing challenges that we were facing beforehand. And so today's goals, building on that work, is again to create a common understanding of the basic characteristics of missing middle housing and why that's important, shifting perspectives on this province-wide housing crisis, and then providing a snapshot of some of the planning and development challenges that we all face in providing attainable housing for our communities, to identify opportunities through land lease communities to provide that attainable housing. And that is, again, particularly focused on the kinds of work I do with Parkbridge, but also related to anyone that would be working with land lease communities, be it private sector or nonprofit that you might find in a community land trust, for example. But before we begin, I think we need to recalibrate the overall housing discussion. And the reason I say that is that I suggest that we collectively should have a community builder's perspective, right? And by that I mean is that community builders, we need to provide housing that addresses the needs, the wants, and the circumstances of all community citizens across their life courses, right? We need to make sure that we have a robust system of providing housing for all people's needs. And a big part of that is the missing middle. Again, in small urban centers and rural communities, that looks different than some of the conversation we might have about missing middle in more urban areas. I'm sure many people during the session today are familiar with this illustration that came out of Opticus Design, and they were the ones that really coined this phrase of missing middle. And although it is primarily focused on more urban centers, even rural communities and small urban centers have their own variation of missing middle. All that it really means is that for those types of communities, the upper end in terms of form and density is probably not applicable, just because of the scale of their communities, but everything else is, and it might be compressed a little bit. But I'm going to suggest that we also expand that discussion. So it's not just about form, it's also about tenure. And in a simplified way, if we look at the types of tenure we have for housing, there's assisted housing, rental housing, cooperatives and other similar models. There's land lease, which is essentially getting more into ownership, then into condominium, and then right to freehold ownership. And again, as we have that continuum in terms of form, there is also a continuum of tenure. And that's something that we need to make sure as community builders that we're addressing, that it's not just the shape and size of the homes, it's how people are living in them through tenure. With that, I'm going to suggest that the future success of rural towns and small urban centers is inextricably connected to their ability to provide missing middle housing for their communities. And if we take a look at, maybe 5 particular characteristics that I think we can all agree on in terms of successful communities, that they all have healthy community design, they all have a high quality sense of place, they have all aspects of accessibility as we understand that, they're all ages friendly, and they have a resilient economic base. And I would make an argument that you can't have that without community-wide attainable housing and having that full range of housing, as I mentioned before. And this isn't just my opinion. If you take a look at any of the organizations or institutions that relate to our industry in terms of being community builders and providing housing and providing successful communities, some of which are shown on the screen here, they all invariably relate, have some of their goals and some of their recommendations focused on the need for providing that mix of housing. And the mix that's missing the most in our communities is that missing middle. So what is the missing middle? Well, if you believe in it, you'll see it. In fact, for the kinds of communities that I'm talking about in this context, in many ways you have historic examples of that. Here's an example where you're dealing with a 6-plex, and here's another one with an additional 5 units. And what's interesting to note is that the regulations we have in place right now make these kinds of developments virtually impossible to build. Now, I'm going to get into the details of what causes that problem, but it is something that needs to be particularly noted and called out, because it is a real challenge for our communities when we can't even learn from our experiences of the past and set up systems and barriers that make it impossible to achieve things that we were able to do in previous generations. Here's another example of a missing middle component that exists. These homes happen to be provide access from a laneway for car parking, as do these. This is a bit of a pocket neighborhood orientation where the parking is in the rear and there's a cluster of homes here. And we also see examples of infill. And again, with all of these, ignoring the architectural style, what we see here is that there is lot fabric and size in this case that allows for an accessory unit to be built. And again, that's another part of that missing middle, the kinds of housing that we aren't seeing a lot of, because typically right now in rural and small urban communities, we seem to be just at either end of the spectrum, which is freehold, detached single-family residential, and then various levels of what I would say is low, perhaps even mid-rise, primarily apartment form condominium, and very little of things in between. And that's the missing middle. Our current systems and actions are actively restricting our ability as community builders to develop this missing middle housing in communities like all across Ontario, and it's in many ways. And so we need to understand the intricate connections between planning and development processes and missing middle housing. And we shouldn't shy away from understanding and addressing issues of community politics as well. So what are some of the examples that create these challenges that we can overcome if we pay greater attention to our planning structures, our processes, the politics around how we manage these projects, and what's brought forth from a development perspective. So the first example is we have regulations and processes that codify and misconstrue concepts of sameness with contextual fit. As someone who, as you saw in the previous slides, I've worked in public sector, also as a consultant, and now in the development industry, and I see it particularly on the municipal side, is that we set up these regulations that don't allow for any change because we have a misunderstanding of urban design and how communities evolve over time and the form that housing takes as neighborhoods change over generations. And we create these regulations that lock in current conditions as opposed to properly managing the resource of the land that the community has for that evolution to the needs that that the community has over time. And so we lock down things with ideas of sameness and call it contextual fit. We also have processes that skew towards unfounded public perceptions that missing middle housing will overburden infrastructure and or reduce neighboring property values. This is the standard kind of NIMBY issues that we hear. I'm not saying that all the issues of the public or neighbors are unfounded, but I think it is foolish of us to not explicitly recognize that NIMBY sentiments are damaging to our ability to provide attainable housing, particularly missing middle. And much of it is linked to that first point. We have regulations in place, again, that misconstrue sameness with contextual fit, and the folks that are seeking to stop all forms of development key off of that and use that as their leveraging point, and basically saying that if it's not exactly the same as the housing that's there now, it will cause these challenges. And we need to really learn how to better have meaningful dialogue so that we understand the concerns of those citizens, but also how to push back appropriately to show, again, that many of those concerns that are brought up are actually unfounded. We also have regulations and processes that mistakenly equate and interchange use, form, and tenure, and that creates insurmountable approvals thresholds. So we need to make sure that our regulations, when we're talking about form, that we're clear about that, that when we're talking about use, that we're clear about that. There's far too much complexity in the regulations, I believe, around housing. When you look at that, the impacts that use has is pretty much the same. If you have homes, the impact of people living in those homes is not going to be that measurably different based on the shape of the home and the number of people that are living in a particular building or on a street. right? I think we overemphasize the impacts that having more people living in a denser form will have on a neighborhood that are actually there. Again, I'm not talking the difference between a neighborhood that is in a highly urbanized environment, like say the city of Toronto, where you're taking a neighborhood of singles or townhomes and then putting in 30-story towers. It's a slightly different issue there. But again, in the small urban centers and rural communities, the impact or the differences between singles, semis, townhomes, 3-story walk-ups and that is really quite minimal, and we shouldn't have our regulations overemphasizing what those differences are. We also have official plan policies that use and restrict the inherent natural evolution of neighborhoods based on prejudicial and ill-conceived notions such as stable neighborhoods. That's something that fellow planners, and I am a registered professional planner, and I've been speaking about this since I've started to see this evolve more and more over the past few years. Stable neighborhoods, that concept is prejudicial and it's ill-conceived, because all neighborhoods in every community are constantly changing. It is the nature of communities that they change. And the idea of putting this kind of language into official plans, I believe, shows a poor understanding of how communities evolve and have always evolved. And it is a way, again, of creating regulations that force sameness and stagnation in communities, and very much limits the ability to provide diversity in housing. Other examples, we have urban design guidelines that create unrealistic and unnecessary parameters for infill housing. Often we see that with laneway housing, when a community wants to adopt that, they've seen it in other urban centers, and then they go through these intensive studies and create these exceedingly complex policies and regulations just to get these secondary units into their built form fabric on laneways. Doesn't need to be made so complicated. We also have zoning bylaws that are not aligned with official plan policies, and that creates a need for unnecessary rezoning applications. And that in itself extends the timelines of creating housing and increases the risks of appeals. We need to realize that the purpose of the zoning is the regulation to enact the goals and vision of the official plan. And the zoning and the official plan should be aligned as much as possible. If every single development of every form of housing that you need to see in your community requires a rezoning, I would argue that your zoning bylaw is seriously broken. It should be, especially if all those forms of housing, and they do, are stated in the official plan. Every official plan speaks to the full range of housing and the need for that attainable housing to be there, and all the forms that would fall under missing middle. And yet the zoning bylaws rarely, if ever, are aligned to make that a reality. And so you're creating unnecessary burdens, which are burdens that are borne out by the residents that will eventually have to live in there through costs and delays. There was the findings of a study that was presented at the AMO conference 2 years ago, so not this past one, in August, the August before, where they were noting that in Ontario it takes on average 15 years to bring new housing product to market because of all the processes we have. This is one of the problems with that. If we look at a 15-year timeline, that's almost a generation. How can we possibly meet the housing crisis we have if it takes that long to bring housing to market? It's a very, very serious problem that we have. Another issue is restricting the ability to provide traditional forms of housing with overly restrictive zoning bylaws, forcing unnecessary applications for amendments. So again, if you saw those images I showed before of those historic forms of housing, they're virtually impossible to build now because of parking requirements or what have you. And we know they work, we know they fit particular needs within that continuum of housing, and yet they're almost impossible to develop. That means our processes aren't achieving the goals that our communities need. So I'm going to talk about 3 more components of the planning system and how this relates to housing cost and availability and viability. So first of all, I don't think anyone on this session is going to be surprised that the development process is not only incredibly complex, it integrates extensive professional expertise. So what we see here is a typical subdivision approvals process. I don't expect you to be able to read these boxes. Just note that there's 109 of them, right? Very, very complex process it takes just to do a standard subdivision, which will then allow houses to be built on those lots. And if we look at the experts that are involved in that, and we list them all out, eventually we see there's about 33 teams of experts, everything from the early appraisal of the lands all the way down to the final designs and financial modeling. Now, if we look at the experience that those people bring to the table, it means that any typical subdivision of 15 units or more has close to 1,000 years of professional experience brought to the table. And that's just on the development side. Then you have the municipal experts. Then you have all the peer review that is done. And yet, when a new development comes forward, we treat it as if, we've never seen one of these before. We treat it as if we're starting with a blank slate. And we also, going back to some of the issues of politics, we allow all discussions about issues to be measured essentially or given the same weight. And I would argue that the quality of work that comes forward, given the regulations we have now through the development industry, these are all pretty much of the highest standard, right? So there is no cutting corners. There is no gaming the system. The number of people involved, their livelihoods, their expertise, their liabilities, their responsibilities, their codes of ethics all come into play when new developments come forward. And we should start treating that level of expertise, I think, a little more seriously, particularly when we're going to the point of making decisions at the political level in front of town councils. The regulations also have as much impact as process on housing cost and feasibility. Here's an example that just shows the differences in terms of the zoning requirements for a community that relates to the built form differences across the residential components identified in their zoning bylaw. And it's interesting to note that there are 6 different zones here identified for singles and another 5 for duplex or semis. And when you take a close look at them, you'll note that their lot size in terms of depth and width and the house sizes in some cases are only, there's only differences by maybe half a meter. I would argue that this is far too fine a grained approach to zoning. And in fact, if you go back to one of my other comments about the issues with forcing unnecessary rezoning applications, this is the result or the cause of that, is that if you are far too fine-grained in your zoning requirements, that means that the marketplace can't bring anything to market based on what the zoning is for that particular lot, or at least you increase the chances of needing a zoning bylaw amendment, which increases time and costs, which also opens it up to an appeal system that can be used to slow down the process of bringing housing to market in a timely fashion. Now, also the relationship between development charges and homeowner financing burden is important to understand. And I'm not here just to kind of play into the trope that developers have a problem with development charges. I think the vast majority of developers, we understand what development charges are for. We're happy to pay those charges because they do finance the infrastructure that communities need. However, there's some real challenges in the way many communities are using that tool, and the information that goes into it from the onset is some of the problem. Quite often we see capital improvement plans, again, particularly in rural communities and small urban centers. These capital improvement plans that are creating exaggerated burdens on new housing by being overambitious in terms of their service targets. I think I just need to, a perfect example of this is, not that long ago, there was a fair amount of interest and money being put into communities who wanted to develop, multi-use recreation centers, right? It became the flavor of the day, and every small urban center and rural community that had an aging arena, and even though their population may not have grown significantly, wanted to have the most up-to-date facility, and it went from being a single pad arena to a twin pad and a pool and multi-use rec facility, et cetera, et cetera. Something that, if you look at the tax base and the population of the community, was unsustainable, but there were funds available through provincial and federal programs that had matching dollars that then allowed those, or it was perceived that they could then put that into their capital improvement plans and then therefore increase the development charges for something, again, that I would argue is an overambitious service target based on the size of the community. And why does that matter? Well, it's not the developer that pays. Just as with any product, there are inputs that are taken into account that then eventually relate to the end price. And so those charges, of course, end up on the costs of the homes. And if we look at, here's an example. Let's say there's a home price of $350,000 and we have a $20,000 development charge. And if we look at that, its relationship to the mortgage amount, we see that across a 20-year mortgage, that these folks then are on the hook for paying $31,000, right? There's essentially an additional $11,000 of interest paid by, excuse me, the homeowners. Well, if you have a 300-unit development, that's the equivalent of almost $9.5 million taken out of the local economy because of the development charges that are on there. Now, again, I'm not saying that all development charges are excessive, but we need to be very careful about what we're trying to fund through them, because it is the homeowners that will end up paying that in the end. And if we are talking about housing attainability, that is a serious issue that we need to understand. So overall, I'd say, enough planning, it's time to make it real. So I'm going to give you an example of how to address missing middle, not only in form, but particularly in tenure for communities across Ontario. And that is this idea of land lease. A land lease is not a new concept. It's something that has actually been around in North America for hundreds of years and is extensively used in Europe, UK, and more and more here in Canada. And it's really quite simple. The homeowner, the residents, buy their home and they lease the land. It is not more complex than that. It looks and feels and has some similarities to a bare land condo, but it's not. Again, they own the home and they lease the land. Land lease, as a process, it uses existing regulatory structures for site plan approvals. So of course there needs to be the lots created or larger blocks through subdivision, but it uses site plan approval because you're getting a number of homes onto a larger lot, not each home having its own lot. Therefore, significantly lower initial investment for the home because you're not paying for the land, and that then creates greater access to that home ownership market. Again, filling that missing middle component in terms of tenure, because it's not full freehold ownership. You're not buying the land. It allows people to enter the homeowner market at a different level, and therefore not having to come up with the same amount of down payment and overall costs for that home. It also acts as the bridge between rental and ownership and creates opportunities, particularly for downsizing seniors, which has been the predominant use of land lease within the Canadian homeownership market. That is changing now, again, because of the housing crisis we see in Ontario. There's more and more interest from this for first-time homebuyers as well. And overall, reduced municipal infrastructure costs because the way this is done is that the typically, as we do in our company Parkbridge as well, is that we manage and maintain and are responsible for the life cycle replacement costs of much of the infrastructure, right? As I said before, it can look and feel a little bit like a condo. That's because it's a private road system done through site plan and that, right? So that's where it can feel similar that way, but that also means that the municipality is not responsible for those life cycle costs. So I'm going to show you some examples of what the benefits and livability of contemporary land lease communities. So historically, land lease came out of trailer home parks, right? That was the kind of first model of this, but now they are stick built homes, singles, semis, townhomes. This can also be done with in other forms as well. So it does meet that some of that broader range of missing middle for rural and small urban centers, particularly the townhome model, and it's really shifted away from what you might expect from an old school kind of trailer home park, while those do still exist. So typically these are all designed with a kind of an active lifestyle component. Much of this is because of the history of where these came from being very much retirement focused, but as it shifts into more first homeowner market and generally to the family market as well, the benefits of that idea of having a active lifestyle perspective and a sort of compact community and high identity for that is being carried forward, right? There's no reason to kind of move on from what we learned in terms of the experiences and the successes of previous communities. We're carrying that forward into the new ones. There's also various amenities, often community halls, recreation centers, those kinds of things. Again, these are managed by the leaseholder, which is the owner of the lands. The residents have access to them. This is not run by the municipality. So again, there's services provided that the municipality does not have to pay for. There is a fair amount of sort of community cohesion created through the programming of the site, and the community and the design, particularly through the community rec facilities and the community halls. Here we see an example of one that is being in the final stages of design and approvals here in a community not far from where I'm sitting here in Townsend Mountains right now. And off to the left, you see the clubhouse or community hall and the open space and the form of housing that is proposed for this land lease community. There's also a fair amount of meaningful access to nature that is integrated into these community designs. And again, because they are primarily within rural and small urban centers, It is very much a good contextual fit in that sense. And yet the housing forms are specific to each of the communities that these are in. So we see again single semis, townhomes, and again for a small urban center, a rural community, this is relatively higher density, but still fitting into that missing middle housing that is needed throughout. This is an example actually from out west. I just wanted to highlight that again, the context for these communities can change, and yet the underlying premise of land lease still holds. This is in Kelowna. This is very typical of the design aesthetic for the homes that you might see out there. And this is also a land lease community where, again, the overall costs to get into the home, if you take the land out of it, is about 30% less, which therefore means that it's fitting in within that range of attainable housing, right? It's about providing, as community builders, that full range, not just focusing on any particular type of housing to solve all the problems that we need to address in terms of providing housing options for all our residents. I'm going to show the site plan as the last slide here to also show some of the benefits of working within the site plan perspective. It allows us to have more flexibility in design, and while still meeting all the density requirements on this case, for example, we hit all the density requirements. We protected a number of the waterways. We provided buffers that were, instead of just the minimum requirement of 15 meters, we provided 30-meter buffers. We provided protection over significant archaeological sites on here. In fact, not only giving easements and protection of those archaeological sites to the municipality, we also gave it to the First Nations group that is in this area. And again, something that is not typically done, but because of the approach to using site plan, it allows us to not have lot fabric dictate as much of the design as you have with standard subdivision. We're also protecting a ridge line here, and providing trails, and overall the site with the green space and impervious surface, we're hitting somewhere in the order of 78% of the site being either green space or impervious surface. So from a environmental and groundwater perspective, it's very high functioning as well. So again, these are some of the benefits that we see from that land lease model. So as community builders, again, I'm going to suggest that we have that responsibility to be aware of, understand, and managing our influence on the availability of missing middle. So we need to shift our perspective to better perceive and understand our community's housing needs. We need to realign our systems to support the creation of all forms of housing that are appropriate to the needs, wants, desires, and circumstances of our citizens across their life courses. We need to refine our regulations to facilitate the creation of diverse housing options. And we need to partner with champions across all sectors in collaboration on this pressing issue that we have. And so before we go turn it over to the questions, I have a few questions for the audience that I'd like you to think about is, what has been the greatest challenge to creating missing middle in your community? And where do the barriers for missing middle housing come from your perspective? And then what strategies or mechanisms are available to your community, either partnerships, investors, employers, funding? What do you have available? And are the things that we can learn from our larger, more urban metropolitan centers that we can adapt for our rural and small urban centers in terms of providing missing middle housing? I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Robert. Very comprehensive presentation there. So as I said, if you would like to ask any questions, if you move your mouse up on the screen until the bar appears, and there's a box that it's got a question mark inside it, and it says show Q&A, and you can type your question in there. So just while we're waiting to see if there are any questions coming in, Robert, you mentioned on one of the examples of the land lease communities that due to the removing the land cost from the equation, that I think you said it was about 30% less expensive than a freehold scenario. Is that a typical saving with this form of housing tenure?
Yeah. I mean, it's anywhere between 25% and as much as 45. It really, and the benefit is because it's always dealing with taking the land cost out of the equation. It therefore shifts and scales to the local context, right? So it's not a defined dollar amount. It's based on the cost of land, which is one of the main drivers of the increase in housing costs. So, but we typically refer to it as 30%. And that's also why land lease as a model, if we look at the community land trusts, which are used extensively throughout the US, work in all different kinds of contexts. The only difference is that they are done as a nonprofit. The company I work for, Parkbridge, we do it as a standard for-profit business. Land lease done through community land trust doesn't have some of the benefits that we can provide because it doesn't scale quite the same way in terms of amenity provision and things of that nature. But the underlying principles are sound regardless of the community it's in.
Okay, so we do have a question that's come in asking, is there a typical duration for land leases?
Historically, typically it's been 21 years. They're renewed, at the end of that. They're also, if the home is sold, it's renewed. But it can also be up to 99-year leases. There's some mechanisms there for those of you that are familiar with the Planning Act. The restrictions on leasing a portion of a lot are 21 years. If the home has its own lot, it can be up to 99. So that's some of the details in that.
Okay, thank you. You'd also mentioned about how historically with the land lease communities, they were targeting the people going into retirement and the active lifestyle, but that is changing now given the unaffordability of the home ownership market for so many people, particularly we're talking about the missing middle. So in Ontario, in the Ontario context, have we started to see communities developed for a more diverse demographic?
Yes, and it's starting to happen. We have some projects ourselves in Innisfil. They're just getting through the planning phases. Also here in Town of the Mountains and elsewhere. What's interesting to note also, even in those places where it is the bridge for downsizing retirees, that in itself also helps shift the market for housing within the community. So if you have a retiree who essentially is now a couple or a single person, but in a family-sized home, they're essentially overhoused, right? And in many rural and small urban centers, there is no place to move into that provides ownership, right? A lot of these types of communities, it's just rental. And for all kinds of socio-cultural issues, people may not want that, and in many cases, it's also even not available. But by providing housing even when it is just for retirees, for them to downsize into. That then also frees up more family housing, right? And that's why we need to look at the housing challenges across the spectrum of form and tenure, because they are very much interrelated. But yes, there are communities where we're seeing more and more interest from families and first-time home buyers coming in, and we're trying to address that within our projects at Parkbridge for sure.
Okay. We have started to have some questions come in now. Can you see those, Robert?
Yeah, let me.
So I think
lease,
the
first
one
step.
there.
What is the first step as a city councillor can do to get the ball rolling to bridge this? Well, in terms of the missing middle, first steps, I gotta say the first step is getting your zoning bylaw aligned with your official plan, because that inherently has impacts on so many different things. Your zoning bylaw is there to implement the official plan, not to lock down what already exists. And that doesn't mean it creates a free-for-all. It means that you're actually facilitating the evolution that your community has adopted as their goal for the future. And if you force it onto, and again, if we're dealing with rural and small urban centers, the small scale developer that maybe does 10 or less units a year, whatever, right? Which is part of the ecosystem of development in your communities. The $5,000, whatever it is for the fees, and then the process of just rezoning something. Again, if you recall that chart where I showed it was basically all the same type of house, but just slightly different, each one requiring a rezoning. That extra cost and the time and the delay will mean that those small scale developers, it's just too much of a hit financially, and process wise, it puts them at risk for anyone in particular to challenge that approval. And so it really stymies their ability to do anything. And also the same thing, of course, for larger scale developers coming in. It also means that you're scaring away potential investment money coming into your community to provide that housing. It complicates all kinds of things in terms of process, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I would say is the very first step, is to understand that your regulatory environment is driving much of what's possible. What else? Can land lease work as infilling project? Sure it can, yeah. I will say for our community type development with Parkbridge, it's probably too small a scale, but again, land lease can work as a model, particularly in much smaller communities than we might go to, or infill projects with a community land trust type thing, where quite often they own the lands in a number of different places as opposed to within one neighborhood, and they just run the same. They are literally landlord, right? They own the land, person buys the house, and there's all the mechanisms in terms of how that works for the land trust and how they keep things attainable and all that. So yeah, it can work. It's just a form of tenure, right? It's not. It doesn't need to be made particularly complicated. In fact, in your zoning bylaws and things of that nature, just as you don't and shouldn't have reference to people's ages, race, ethnicity, tenure also shouldn't be identified in your zoning. It's irrelevant. It's a form of ownership. You need to be looking at the built form of the housing and that. So yes, it can work anywhere. Approximately how many homes are included in a single land lease community? For a Parkbridge community, so we're Canada's largest developer, owner, operator of land lease communities. For us, it's got to be 200, 250 units for it to work for our model. There's one not far from where I'm sitting right now that probably has 50 to 70. That is a smaller scale operator. It really comes down to the owner and how they want to manage that. I would guess if you want to provide any kind of amenity buildings and that would be where that would be what dictates your threshold, right? So if you want to have a community hall, that needs to make sense for the number of people. You wouldn't have a community hall with 3 houses, right? Well, you might choose to, but I would argue business-wise that doesn't make sense. And there's also an unnecessary amenity in terms of trying to generate community cohesion. So it really comes down to your vision for the community. Maintenance. So how do typical maintenance and amenity costs compare to typical low-rise condo fees? What we try to do is that we are, because a lot of that is based on just on the marketplace, on the costs of things. Land lease communities, we come under the same provisions of kind of landlord-tenant requirements. So there's certain things that we can't pass on that you might be able to do in other types of structures. But with ours, not only do you have the maintenance fees in there, but that also, because we provide other amenities that we manage. So it's not quite a apples to apples comparison, right? So with a condo, typical condo fee, yeah, you might have a meeting space or what have you, where we would have the clubhouse and that. So it's kind of the next level up, and our amenity packages look a little different too. But it generally, the costs of things are what drive that, and so that just is dictated by the marketplace. What else do we have here? As a municipality, how do we sell the land lease model to other developers? Well, that's a great question. I don't know how to answer that. That's up to them to decide if that's what they want to do. I think anytime you have dialogue and conversations and say that your municipality is open to a broad range of housing options, that is how you will attract all the different kinds of developers that your community needs. And again, it's small scale, medium scale, large scale. We are a little bit unique because we have a single shareholder, which is institutional investors from BCI, which is a retirement fund. So when we go into rural communities, it's pretty rare that you have institutional investors coming into a small community. So that's a little bit of a weird animal that way. But a lot of the triggers that would make it make more sense for us will actually help your smaller scale developers and medium scale developers, and also for some of these examples, even homeowners that want to provide additional housing. So if, for example, the laneway housing, if you make that easy to execute, that means that homeowner can now create a rental unit. That means that their home is more affordable to them, and you've diversified your housing option with that rental unit. That's not going to solve the housing crisis, but that's one unit, one solution that actually helps 2 different kinds of families there. So you need to address things at that scale, as well as at the scale of folks like us and other developers being able to come in and truly understand what is possible in your community in terms of the regulations, not having it be too complex and have too much process that causes delays. And it really, I'll go back to that point, it shouldn't take 15 years to build homes. You're providing roads, infrastructure, and houses. Every community has been doing that for the whole lifetime of that community. Why do we treat it like every project is somehow the first one we've ever seen, and we have to ignore all the expertise and experience that goes into it because we're afraid of some sort of error or nefarious intent? This is just housing. It's not complicated.
Actually, Robert, related to that question about selling the land lease model. Could you elaborate maybe a few points on what would make a land lease model attractive to a developer versus selling the house and the land?
It's from a business perspective, it's just a different model on how that business wants to see their returns, right? It is a much longer game. Your investment, in oversimplified terms, your investment sits there for a lot longer while the returns trickle in. It is very different. So that just comes down to how those people that are putting up the money want to see the returns on their investment. Now, I will say some of the things that some of these smaller communities and rural communities need to understand is that they need to have the approvals in place and the regulations in place that make any of this stuff viable in the first place. So, for example, there are plenty of communities where there are very, very long-standing approvals in place that every 3 years, 5 years come for renewal, and there's reasons why we allow that and when they make sense. However, particularly in small urban centers and rural communities where growth typically is a little slower, and even if it is, as we're seeing now, much faster, it's at a smaller scale, just inherent with the scale of these communities. When you have a lot of approvals on the books that aren't going anywhere, that can also impact the desirability of other investors to come in. Because if they see that, and I'm making up numbers here, that your community of 10,000 people has hundreds of units approved on the books, as they say, but no one's, and they've been like that for years and years, sometimes decades, it's very difficult for investors to look at that and say, oh, I can come in and I can now get my approvals through this very long drawn out process and outpace those other ones, because at any moment in time, those could be turned on and be in the marketplace. And therefore I'm at risk to have that competition. And that market of that small community is only so big, right? So we need to be really careful about what approvals we have out there, what actions being taken. It may not be business friendly to just always extend those things indefinitely. In fact, you might be hurting new businesses and new opportunity coming in because it also locks up infrastructure commitments, right? So you could have hundreds of units approved and your wastewater treatment facility has to account for those, which creates a cap on other folks coming in, even if those ones aren't online yet, because they can't provide approvals beyond what's serviceable. And so there's a lot of sensitivity and understanding around all these things that make it difficult for investors to come in and provide housing, and that's the reality. It is outside money that provides the housing in most of our communities. It's just the reality of it.
There was a question that we haven't dealt with yet about ownership structure. How is ownership structured for the buyer in a land lease scenario?
The buyer owns the home and they lease the land. That's a pretty broad statement, so I'm not sure what other detail they're getting into, but it's that simple. So if they sell the home, in our case, we just renew the lease with the new homeowner, but they own the home, and even though typically buildings and homes that are seen as a depreciating asset, we all know that with land values going up and that homes tend to go up, and even in this case, what we've seen in our communities, even though land is taken out of the equation, just because of the pressures on the housing market, there is appreciation of the homes that are on our lands. And I would expect that to be the same with other land lease communities as well. So those folks see that capital gain when they sell the home, even though, again, they're not selling the land. So it just means the price is at a different starting point and different end point.
Have you got as far in your models where let's say it was a 21-year lease coming near its end and the homeowner wished to stay?
Oh, yeah. That's and then we just renew the lease.
Okay. Well, we don't have any more questions come in at this time, and we won't take up your time unnecessarily. But if anyone did have something they wanted to ask, there is still some time to do that. Maybe just give a minute or two for people to do that. I just wanted to pick up on where you were talking about under the land lease model, Robert, that it reduces the municipal infrastructure costs. Could you just talk a little bit more about that, please?
Well, that's where I said it's somewhat similar to a bare land condo, where typically the home or the development is with private roadways. Again, Parkbridge has been around for 22 years now, and so across our portfolio of almost 100 communities, and some of which are resorts and that, so there's some diversity there. We have the full range of everything from full municipal services to we have on-site sewage treatment facilities and everything in between. But typically now, the way it works is that it's a private road system, and then depending on the preferences of the municipality, we're also responsible for the infrastructure under the ground that connects to the municipal services. And so that means the street maintenance, snow removal, and life cycle replacement costs are borne by us, including sidewalks and all that as well. And yet, there's also another benefit from the management of these. Not only the facilities that we provide that create this great community cohesion, overall, we see this, particularly in our retirement communities, that our communities are so close-knit and people feel such a strong connection to it that we have an awful lot of clubs and things that are there, and people then volunteering out in the broader sort of host community, right? Because they feel well connected to that place and that community. So they're the ones that the retirees are out there, volunteering at the hospital and at the library and all that. And then we also see that the municipality only has one tax bill that they send out, where we pay the tax bill. So they don't, let's say we've got a community of 300, still just one tax bill. That does have some implications in terms of the municipality having an easier process in terms of that chunk of money coming in in terms of management as well.
Okay, got a couple more questions come in.
Here we are. Is there a happy medium between what the land developer wants, higher density matching current official plan and zoning, versus requesting to change all of the lot regulations?
Your volume's a bit low, Robert.
Oh, there we go. It's probably from me coughing and I keep moving away here. Happy medium between what the land developer wants, higher density matching current official plan and zoning regulations, versus requesting to change all of the lot regulations, size and front yard setbacks. Okay, so first of all, current official plan. So I'll assume the zoning is wrong in my perspective, that it's not always meeting the intent of the official plan. And I'm going to be a bit nitpicky here. It's not that the developer wants to match the current official plan. The official plan is the want of the community. It is the community's choice of what the future that they have through their process that matches provincial policy framework. And then through all that public process, the community comes together and says, this is the vision we have for our future. And so when an investor comes in, a developer, or even a local developer, they see now that that is what's possible in that community, and therefore they can then make the determination of it's worthwhile or not to address that. So it's not the developers that are pushing the goals of the community. They're trying to match what the communities are. Now, in terms of that happy medium, I mean, that is why we have public processes, but you also need to understand that are your systems in place to actually achieve the goals that you say you want, right? So issues of setbacks and that, you know, I get it that there are folks that try to, there are instances where they try to maximize it to a level that is a bit shocking for either a street or a neighborhood, and that, and I, having lived through that when I lived and worked in Vancouver, and there was a lot of money coming in when the transition of Hong Kong was happening, and it was literally just pouring money into the housing market. We saw homes being built at maximum envelope, right? That's where the whole monster home thing came from, and it was very very unusual because they hadn't seen that before. So yeah, I recognize those things do happen. To protect against that is just have zoning regulations in place that can actually achieve the requirements of your official plan. That's it doesn't need to be more complicated than that. Another one, recognizing it will change based on location. Do you know on average the percentage difference between land lease costs versus typical freehold costs, i.e. land lease versus, yeah, it's always taking the land out of the equation, and typically it's that 30%. We see that pretty much everywhere, give or take, right? So even if there's an increase, it still maintains that kind of balance, and that's pretty broad brush, kind of clunky way to look at it, but it does primarily hold true. What happens if the lease isn't renewed? There is no value to the landowner to not renew the lease. So it's not something that happens. I guess theoretically, but that's really not a thing, because a home without the lease, you know, coming in from that has no value to the landowner. And again, there's all kinds of other, you know, just to note, there's all kinds of protections in there because we come under the same provisions, you know, Landlord Tenant Act issues. So there's all kinds of protections in place inherent in the system anyway. Okay, so someone owns the home on a piece of land that they don't own or control. So I guess the question there is, why would they do that? I guess I'm kind of reading into it. Well, they would go into that because it is a lower threshold to get into ownership. Like you could still rent, but you also have no control over anything then in that same kind of framing that I might project onto the question. So this isn't the answer for everyone. This is a type of ownership along that range of, like, you know, co-op, for example. You really don't own anything there. You own a percentage of the corporation that is the co-op. Same kind of thing. Why would you do that? Well, because for some people that works. Condominium, bare land condo does not work for some folks as well. Right? And it's also, again, we need to provide that range of housing that addresses people's needs, their wants, and their circumstance in life. Not everyone needs or wants or is in a position to seek freehold. We have so pushed everything towards freehold being the only answer, and we have not focused enough on the opportunities and requirements for all the other types of homes. In fact, I think we, just as with the built form, I mentioned earlier, there's that missing middle. It's the same on the tenure. We focus either on the freehold being the solution, or and I'm not saying we should ignore any of them, but the other end of the threshold is we focus on assisted housing, as we should, right? There is massive needs, and I think as a society we agree that assisted housing is very important for all the reasons. But that can't solve everything in between, and vice versa. We need all these other uses, tenure and forms between those two thresholds to really work. Another question, is there a projected end date for the developer's land lease? What could these communities look like 100 years? Would the lots end up being subdivided and sold off anyway? So I'll take those in reverse. So there aren't lots typically with a single home on them, right? So again, it's a block with multiple homes. So that doesn't work. And I'm assuming, again, projecting into there, it's not like what you would see with an apartment building that was for rental and the form maintained the same, but then became a condominium. The tenure changes and then people can buy it. That isn't kind of what happens here. You know, I think it's great that we're looking 100 years out, but just like any aspect, any neighborhood of a community, you know, what does 100 years, you know, 5 generations look like? I don't know. It is a investment of a certain kind in terms of those returns that people are looking at, different to someone who builds freehold homes. Could they evolve, and could, let's say, a large block of homes, let's say, be bought out and then reinvested with a higher density form? Sure. But those folks own those homes, so they still need to be paid for. You know, that you don't just, you know, sweep in and take them away. It's very different than what you see, particularly in the US, with trailer home parks, because those are mobile homes. They can be moved, right? It's what we refer to is that with this model, with the on-site, you know, the stick frame construction, and that, you know, there's a shared equity partnership. You know, those homes are attached to the ground. No one's moving them. So we need to make sure that there is that understanding that we create that shared equity and that sort of positive dependency on each other. But theoretically, it's 100 years down the road, and there's 100 homes in this one section, and the community has evolved enough that now people are seeking 3-story walk-ups or 5-story buildings. Sure, maybe they all get bought out, and that happens, but that's a decision that happens at that time. No different than any other neighborhood. I think did I get all the questions there?
I think you did. I'm not seeing any more. We'll probably wrap up. So thank you ever so much, Robert, for your thoughts and thought provocation. I'll actually hand things over. Oh, I see there was one. Maybe we can squeeze one more question in. Okay, we'll do one more question, and then I'll hand things over to Arvona Zvias, the Director of Housing here at the county, to close things up.
Okay. So it says you spoke a lot about the restrictions or administrative challenges for life lease in your presentation, financial, what has made life lease communities tenable? Okay, so a couple things, life lease and land lease, two different things. I've been referring to land lease. Life lease is essentially you have, as I understand it, you have rights to the home essentially through your natural life. That's what you own or have access to through life lease. Very different thing than land lease. You own the home and you can sell it, you can will it to someone, etc. All that. So, so what has made so I'm going to translate it to land lease communities tenable in communities where you've built them. So for us, again, we're a larger company, so we have that scale threshold in terms of size of community, a couple hundred units ish, right? That means that we, just like any developer, although our returns are on a different model than freehold, it needs to make sense for us financially. And so we need to look at it and say, is there enough marketplace there, or can we create enough marketplace for folks to want to buy that many homes, right? If if your community has the potential for that growth, then that makes sense. Also, we have the ability, because we've historically done a lot of retirement communities, but now, as I said, more in terms of sort of all folks across their life courses. If it's a retirement community, that allows us perhaps to go into places that aren't inherently growing, but we can attract the people to that because something that your town may have that is particularly appealing, right? So it really comes down to, in the end, from our perspective, does it still pencil out? But again, if you do it on a smaller scale, as a community land trust, as a nonprofit, that has very different implications. The restrictions and in terms of administrative challenges and all that, those apply to every type of developer that's out there. Your local builders that are doing anywhere from 1 to 20 homes a year, to someone that just has a one-off that wants to add a secondary suite to their home. All that stuff still applies. So that's kind of independent of what our needs are. And as as a professional planner, speaking to other planners that might be out in the session today, we got to stop with the some of this nonsense that we've created in terms of our systems. It is really problematic when we're creating regulations that make it virtually impossible to build the thing that every community says they need and are desperate for. It makes no sense, and we need to figure out how to eliminate those challenges in terms of the regulations and administration of them, so that the communities can achieve the goals and visions they have in their official plans. That's the end product they're seeking. Why is it so difficult to create? We got to address that.
Okay, thanks, Robert. So we'll hand over to Arvona now to wrap things up for us this morning.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, John, and thank you very much, Robert, for your very compelling lead through land lease opportunities, as well as the very intricate connections between planning and housing development. In particular, the interplay between zoning and official plans. As somebody who is not a planner, who works in the social housing and affordable housing field, I found that particularly interesting, your entire presentation. And of personal note, I lived in the UK for about 6 years at the in the mid late 1980s and up to about the mid 1990s, which really dates me. But I do know that when I was living in London, the only way that people could get into the home ownership market was definitely to go into situations where they leased the land, where they went into a leasehold situation. And it was the only way for any number of people to be able to live remotely close to or in any sort of proximity to the settings in which they lived in the urban area of the Greater London area. So thank you very much for helping us understand how that could be compelling and how that could be useful here in our Ontario setting and in the county of Simcoe. So thank you very much for Robert, and we can all do a round of applause from our own virtual desks. I'd also really like to say thank you to all the participants for joining us today. I'm sure that in your work lives you are being pulled in many different directions, so the fact that you've taken time out of your busy schedules to join us today is awesome, and we thank you very much for participating. We'd like to say thank you to CMHC for partnering with us in this initiative, and as well I'd like to say thank you to all the county staff who behind the scenes have learned very quickly how to use the technology so that we can pull this off. And it's a good thing we're not doing the technology, or it's a good thing I'm not doing the technology, because we would not have pulled it off. So thank you very much to the team. Thank you to John for emceeing. Please, everybody, stay tuned. We are going to take a break from doing a virtual affordable housing forum in December, but we will be back in January and we will be circulating information about the virtual forum ahead of time. If you've got any suggestions to us, we're very happy to take your suggestions, and you can use the same email address that you would have used to register for today's event. So on behalf of the county, thank you everybody. Happy Monday. Stay safe. Bye now.